Ladies and gentlemen, hello again. Welcome to another Reflected Reality Simulations video. My name is Graham, this is X-Plane 11 and the FlightFactor A320. It's part 5 of the video series, and following on from part 4, we're going to take another look at non-precision approaches. In part 4, we flew an RNAV approach using the aircraft in what we call the fully managed configuration. We used Final App on the autopilot, and the aircraft flew itself laterally and vertically on the approach. Today we're going to do it a little bit differently. We're going to use selected modes. By selected modes I mean we're going to use Track and FPA to make manual inputs on the flight control unit to put the aircraft exactly where we want it. So we're overhead Kefalonia in Greece at the moment. The aircraft's in the hold on the Kilo Fox November VOR. And we're going to fly the VOR Zulu procedure onto runway 32. Let's take a look inside and we'll bring up the approach chart. So this is the approach that's published by the Greek AIP. We're overhead the beacon at the moment on that 155. We're going to fly around the hold once and then we'll go outbound on the procedure. The initial procedure is 155, so it's the same as the inbound track towards the VOR. Out to 12 DME, descending down at a maximum of 185 knots down to 3,000 feet before turning inbound and picking up the 141 radial. 141 inbound is 321, the reciprocal, and we'll probably use 351 to give us a 30-degree intercept. We're going to use Track on the FCU to make that happen. Once we're at 3,000 feet, we're going to use FPA to guide the aircraft down roughly a 3-degree profile towards the runway. This is what's published by the Greek authorities, and we could fly this procedure quite happily, but it wouldn't really be allowed under most European operational rules at the moment. EASA ops don't permit you to fly this kind of dive and drive approach. We have to try and fly a continuous descent approach, and I believe that's the same for the FAA as well. So what I've done is I've modified the chart ever so slightly. You can see on the profile, rather than descending at this 11 DME point, we're going to descend at 9.1 DME. That will fly along 3000, 9.1 and then down on roughly a 3-degree profile, and we should get the final approach fixed 2000 on that profile. It just means that once the aircraft starts down the final approach slope, it will continue down on profile all the way towards the runway. It's widely regarded as a slightly safer way to operate aircraft these days. The FMC is all pretty much set up at the moment. We've got the hold, and rather than loading the procedure, I've simply loaded the center fix for the visual approach onto runway 32. I don't need the guidance from the FMC because I'm going to use the radio aids to fly this. I'll put a little bit more detail in the video description as to why you might want to fly a selected mode approach rather than a fully managed approach. Radio aids, we need to put the Kilo Foxtrot November into both sides, and we know that it's the course of 321. I'll put that on both sides. The performance, we're already in approach phase, minimum's loaded and the MET's loaded. We've got cam winds at the moment. I'll bring up the PFD, I'll bring up the nav display, I'll put that into VOR mode. I'll make sure that I've got a bearing pointer for VOR number 1. And I'll bring up the right hand side nav display as well with bearing pointer for VOR number 2. This is just so you can see the difference between the CDI mode and the nav display mode. There's one more thing I've got to do, and I wouldn't have to do it in the real aeroplane. At the moment the DME indicator is showing 6.5. As we go outside 10 miles, I'll lose the decimal place. Now the real aircraft doesn't lose the decimal place. The problem is the manuals for the aircraft don't actually go into detail about when that happens. So I'll need to try and work it out by a process of trial and error. I can work around it by putting the Kilo Fox November into the progress page here. That gives me a distance. Now it's very similar, but it's not quite the same. The DME distance is the distance between the aircraft and the VOR station. 8,000 feet is 1.3 nautical miles up, so it'll count down to about 1.3 on the DME. This distance here is simply the distance over the ground, so it will read down to 0. Now that's a factor when you're directly overhead the beacon, but as we get further away, it's really not a factor for us at all. So as I mentioned, we'll bring up the chart as well. 155 inbound towards the VOR. You can see the needle's on 155 at the moment, and the initial approach procedure is 155 as well. So I'll push the button for Track FPA, and I'll pull 155, so we've got track mode. I'll also select 3000 for the altitude. We've got 3000 blue. We'll descend once we go overhead the beacon. The last thing I've got to do, and again it's a sim specific, is I will do an extended centerline or radial in on the center fix and insert. The reason I'm doing that is because the model at the moment doesn't exit the hold in the same manner as the real aircraft. It's not a big problem, just extend the centerline on the CF. So looking at the progress page, we're about 1 mile from the KFM. You see as we get closer, the difference between DME and the track distance changes. We're going to fly the aircraft outbound by using the bearing pointer here. Remember, we can pull the tail of the needle and push the head of the needle. We've got a much better scale to work with on the nav display here. As we're overhead the beacon, I'll pull for open descent. That's thrust idle, open descent, and I'll manage the speed. Rather than go into detail about the ins and outs of tracking the bearing pointers, if you have a look at my radio navigation video from about a year and a half ago, that goes into a lot of detail on the mechanics of actually following these radio aids. But suffice to say, at the moment the tail of the needle is on 155, and that's quite happy. We're tracking outbound on the radial. What we are going to struggle with though is getting down to 3000 feet by 12 miles. We've only got about 8.5 miles to go, and I still need to lose 4,500 feet. I don't need to be exactly at 3000 feet for the procedure, but I do need to be level about 2 miles before the final descent at 9.1 inbound. I could use the speed brake, but the speed brake's not very effective at lower speed, so I'm going to use the flaps instead. I'll select flap 1, and because the speed is managed, it will come back to S speed. I'm going to intervene further and select 180, so 180, pull to select. The pointer goes blue to indicate a selected mode. And once it's below the 200 knot indication for the flap limiting speed for flap 2, I'll select flap 2. Once it's got flap 2 and speed 180, it'll descend around 1500 feet per minute. That should be more than enough. Always coming back to cross-check the tracking as well. So there we go, below 200. Now, of interest, watch the vertical speed as I select flap 2. So as the flap rolls out to flap 2, you'll see the vertical speed starts to increase. That's a slight balloon as it selects flap 2. If we're flying a decelerated approach on an ILS or using final app, that wouldn't be a problem. But what I want to do is avoid any disturbances to the profile unnecessarily after that 9.1. So what I'll do is at 11.1 inbound, I'll select gear down, flap 3, flap full. FPA is very good. It'll try and fly a 3-degree profile, but if an environmental factor such as the selection of flaps takes us above the profile, it won't get back on the profile, it will simply fly a parallel 3-degree profile. We just need to be careful of that. And it's the same with the track as well. I'll go into a little bit more detail about the how the track and the FPA modes work in the video description. Some of the pitfalls in using them as well. So just about 12 miles, you see we've lost a decimal place now. At 12 miles, it's that left turn onto 351 to give a 30-degree intercept. There we go. 351 coming up. So we can see the CDI, the bearing pointer and the track there. The track pointer there is effectively going to push that needle towards the 321 inbound course, and it's pulling the tail around. You see with flap 2, we're doing 1500 feet per minute down and 1700 feet to lose, so that's fine. It's all going to work out, I think. If you're trying to fly the needles on the nav display, you might find it gets slightly cluttered with the runway up here. Make sure that your range is set appropriately, and you can essentially move anything that would clutter the display into the middle, so you've got a clear view of the bearing pointer. 20 miles works for most approaches. So 1,000 feet to go in the descent. It's looking good. I'm about to roll out on 351. To fly the intercept, once the CDI bar crosses the nose of the yellow aircraft symbol here, once it gets roughly over the nose, I'll turn left onto the final track of 321. And I'll keep an eye on that. So remember, there's speed alt star, it's capturing 3000, 9.1 is the descent point, so 11.1 I'll manage the speed and start putting the gear down. It's rolled out on a heading that looks roughly appropriate at the moment. So I'm going to focus on getting the aircraft configured, then we'll come back to the tracking. 11.1 miles, speed's managed. The power comes off, speed starts to decrease, so I'll put the gear down, I'll arm the speed brake, and I'll put the turn off and taxi lights on. As the speed's still coming back, I'll select flap 3, and finally flap full. Now I want to pre-select my 3 degrees, and as we approach 9.3, I'll pull for FPA. 9.3, there's FPA 3. I'll also refine the tracking ever so slightly. I need to come to the right a little bit. So my first check is 8 miles, 2660. The missed approach altitude is 8,000 feet, so because I'm below that, I can select it in the window. The issue would come if my missed approach was 2,000 feet, because in the FPA mode it will capture any altitude you've got selected. So 8 miles, 2660, there's 8 miles, 2660. I'm finished with that display now because I've got my decimal place back. Tracking looks good. We can see the needle is roughly on 322, 321. And the next check is going to be 7 miles, 2340. So 7 miles, 2340. It's maybe slightly high. If I put another 0.1 on there, that will make me 10 feet lower over 1 mile. So the next check is 6 miles and 2000. Coming up here, six miles, again 20 feet high. We'll just leave that on 3.1, maybe try 3.2, and the tracking looks good. Let's try 322, see how that works. Again, I'll put a little bit in the description as to why those numbers aren't quite lining up. Next check is 5 miles, from this table now, 1680. 5 miles, 1680. I'll go back to 3.1, that's sensible. We've got landing no blue, auto brake selected, and we're fully configured for the approach. The next check is 4 miles, 1360. Minimum's 1300. So 4 miles, 1360, finish with the map, minimum. And we're visual. There's the airfield, 2 and 2, 2 reds, 2 whites. Finish with the display here, autopilot off, flight director's off. We'll fly the aircraft on the birdie display. The VDEV is in play now. That's okay for this approach because it's a 3 degree approach and the instrument approach is 3 degrees as well. may not always be appropriate to use the VDEV. Just be aware of how the VDEV is coded. Because we loaded the visual approach, I know it's following a 3-degree path. But primarily, we're flying the aircraft by looking out the window, looking at the runway, and looking at the PAPIs. We can use our rules of thumb.
Approaching 32.
140 knots is around 700 feet per minute for that 3 degrees. We can also make sure that we can just see a little bit of the 2.5 degree line inside the birdie symbol. Predominantly, we're flying this visually, but keeping the scan going on the instruments.
500.
So only an aiming point marker, no touchdown zone markings.
300. 200. 100.
Looking at the end of the runway now.
50. 40. 30. 20. Retard. 5.
Spoilers.
5,000 feet
Rev
remaining.
green. Decel. Max reverse. And before we get below 70 knots, I'll select reverse idle. There's no parallel taxiway here, so I'll have to turn on the runway. There is a turning spot at the end, but instead we'll do the turn on the runway. It's wide enough to do that. I'll select forward idle and just a touch of the brakes. I'll come to a halt on the runway and we'll talk about the turn procedure. So I'm flying it from the left hand seat at the moment, which means I'm going to make my first turn towards the left edge of the runway. I need to turn 25 degrees and then I can continue until my seat is at the edge of the runway. A320 can turn this way on a 30-meter wide runway. This runway is 45, so we don't need to go all the way to the edge. But even if I did, although the flight deck would be over, the nose gear would not be over. There's 25 degrees. The key is to do it really nice and slowly. So towards the edge of the runway, we'll turn. Have a look outside. You see that we're still well on the runway. And keeping it nice and slowly. Nice and slow in the turn. The vast majority of commercial aircraft are very light on the nose gear. You want to keep the weight as nicely balanced over the main gear as you can so that the aircraft is able to rotate at takeoff. But obviously that means there's not much weight on the nose at all. So you want to avoid skipping the nose gear.
On runway 14.
On wet runways, it's quite easy to slide the nose gear if you try and turn too tightly, and on taxiways for that matter. Now we're taxiing in. I shall stow the spoilers, retract the flaps, turn the TCAS system off, so it's just the transponder, and start the APU. Obviously we turn the weather radar off as well, it's still not implemented in the mod. I'll leave the landing lights and the strobe lights on because we're on an active runway. I'm taxiing on the runway, 30 knots is fine. On a taxiway around about 20 to 25 is appropriate. We can also make sure we go back to heading VS and put the flight directors back on for the next sector. So APU is nearly available. There we go. We'll taxi the aircraft onto the apron and shut it down. We've not done that for a wee while. So approaching the lead off, I'll set the strobes off. I'll turn all the lights off because there's almost certainly a marshaller or a follow me vehicle in real life here. and no parking stands, so we'd have a marshaller. We'll just find somewhere sensible to park the aircraft. So, come to a halt, set the parking brake, make sure the APU available, shut down the engines, make sure the slides are disarmed, turn the seatbelts off, fuel flow is 0, N1's spilling down, select the beacon off, and the pilot monitoring is going to select the fuel pumps off, and set the transponder to 2000 and stand by. So got the part brake, engines are shut down, beacon and seat belts are off. We use the tablet here. Let's get the ground power unit plugged in, front and rear doors, and we'll open the cargo doors as well. Put the ground power on the aircraft, and then we can shut down the APU. Let's take a look outside. So here we are, shut down on the parking apron, following a selected mode VOR approach to runway 32 at Kefalonia. Firstly, we had the FMC set up with the visual approach onto the runway, just so it had something to arm the approach phase with. We tracked around the hold. We selected track mode on the FCU and went outbound on that 155. We descended down to 3,000 feet using flap 2 and a low airspeed to help get the aircraft down for the turn at the end of the procedure turn. As we approached 2 miles before the final descent point, we managed the speed, put the gear down, selected flap 3 and flap full. That allowed us to do what's called a fully stabilized approach, where the aircraft was at the final approach speed prior to leaving the platform altitude. We armed an FPA of 3 degrees, and we pulled for 3 degrees 0.2 miles before the descent point, following that continuous descent all the way down to the runway. Once we were safely below the missed approach altitude, we made sure that was selected on the FCU in the event we would climb up there for a missed approach. We made sure that we weren't going to select a missed approach altitude that would cause a capture on the final approach. So if you get a really low final approach altitude, let's say 2,000 feet, and you're starting the approach from 3,000 or 4,000 feet, be really careful about that. It's good to use the 1,000 feet call as a check to make sure you've got the missed approach out in. We landed the aircraft conventionally on the runway with the flight directors off, using the birdie and the PAPIs for our primary visual reference. And then finally we did a turn on the runway. From the left-hand seat of the aircraft, the initial turn is left 25 degrees towards the edge of the runway, then turning right back towards the centre line. If the first officer was flying it, the initial turn would have been to the right. Finally, taxiing in, we left the landing lights and the strobes on as we're on an active runway. As always, I'll put some more details in the video description. As I mentioned throughout the video, it's quite a complicated process, and there's a number of reasons why you would want to do that. So I'll put that in the description, and I'll try and keep the description up to date with any questions that you have. If you'd like to ask anything about the video or any comments, please feel free to leave them in the comments section. The next video, we're going to take a look at visual approach, and then following on from that, we'll fly instrument approach, circling to land as a visual procedure. So that's basically the culmination of everything we've looked at so far. As always, thanks very much for listening to me for so long. I really do appreciate it, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Thank you.